Up next on the TWIP network, Gordon Lang and I take a look at the new Fujifilm X-Pro2 on All About the Gear. Good morning or afternoon, depending on where you may be living at this very moment. This is Doug Kay with Gordon Lang, and we're here this morning to discuss the Fujifilm X-Pro2. Hey, Gordon, how you doing?
I'm very good, Doug. How are you?
I'm pretty well. Waking up, got my iced tea. You've probably done your coffee for the day.
I've had enough coffee. If I have any more coffee, I'll just start shaking uncontrollably.
I do that right away. Okay. We've been a while. I've been traveling. You've been on a lot of press junkets. You've been reviewing a lot of cameras, and there were some announcements in January, and now we're finally getting our hands on real production copies of these cameras instead of just evaluation copies. So we're going to have some great reviews in the weeks to come. Tell us, Gordon, about the new Fuji X-Pro2.
Okay, so the X-Pro2 is the new flagship camera in Fujifilm's X series. It's a mirrorless body. It's a rangefinder camera. It has 24 megapixels, and it comes 4 years after the original X-Pro1. Now, the X series is actually 5 years old, but the X-Pro1 4 years ago was the first model to have interchangeable lenses. So that kind of launched the interchangeable X series. And to be honest, a lot of people, there's been so many rumors over the years about a potential X-Pro2, and it never came to fruition. So I think a lot of people, including myself, thought that maybe Fujifilm were not going to release a new version, but here it is in my hands, and it's a very nice camera. Shall we do some prices?
Yeah, this is it's a little pricey, if you will. $16.99 US, about $1,700. I forget what the old one was, or I didn't even check if you could buy an X-Pro1, what it would cost you today. But yeah, $1,700 US.
And that's £1,349 if you're buying it in the UK. That's with VAT already added.
The shrinking pound.
Absolutely. So the interesting thing about the X-Pro2 is that externally it looks a great deal like the X-Pro1, and that's a deliberate thing so that people who are familiar and love the X-Pro1 will get straight to work at this. It was a very familiar camera to use, but Fujifilm has actually made a considerable number of changes. I mean, over those 4 years, it has really refined the X series experience. With the X-Pro1, it introduced the idea, first of all, of having interchangeable lenses on this system, starting off with an interchangeable lens system with the X-trans sensor. Now, this is Fujifilm's unique way of capturing images because it uses a different color filter array to other cameras. And we could do a whole show just about color filter arrays, but I suspect everybody would turn off. So if you're interested in that, just check out my reviews at Camera Labs or anyone else who's written about this. The bottom line is that it produces quite a unique kind of look in terms of sharpness and color, and it's all tied in with their processing as well. The X-Pro1 also introduced the idea of having a kind of hybrid optical and electronic viewfinder. But beyond that, to me and to most people, it kind of suffered compared to a lot of modern cameras. It had very slow autofocus. The handling wasn't very good on that camera, but it won a lot of people over with its style and operation. Now, over the following 4 years, Fujifilm has considerably refined the X series experience. It's gone from X-trans 1 to X-trans 2, which is on most of the bodies prior to this. It has made massive improvements in autofocusing and general handling. And the X-Pro2 inherits all of that, plus more. They've added even more. So even if you're not that interested in the X-Pro concept, what the Pro 2 shows you, I hope, is maybe a hint at what could be coming to future X series bodies across the range. So shall we go over some of the new features?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when we looked at what this is similar to, by the way, Gordon, you pointed out to me that this is really the only APS-C rangefinder camera, rangefinder style. So, it looks sort of like a Leica. It's like a Leica M in the sense that it's got interchangeable lenses, it's rangefinder. But on the other hand, it's also got, because it's a hybrid viewfinder, you can use it with an EVF, and which is pretty much like the normal camera, digital camera that we're all used to, right?
Yeah, well, in fact, let's just start with that viewfinder straight away. It's the thing that really defines the X Pro 1 and 2, as opposed to almost every other camera that's out there. So as a rangefinder, so basically there's two main modes on this viewfinder, and you switch between them using this dial on the front. Now it's reminiscent of the old kind of self-timer countdown on old film cameras. You'd twist it around and it would be almost like she's gonna blow, zzz, click, like that. But you use the same looking lever now to switch between the viewfinder modes. So there's two main modes. The first one, which is the thing that makes it really unique, is the optical rangefinder. Now, when you look through the viewfinder, pretty much everything's in focus, and you actually see more than the camera is going to capture. That is a typical rangefinder feature. Now, on most film rangefinders, you would then have a grid, a square, a frame that would show you what you are going to capture, but you'd be able to see beyond that. And that is fantastic if you're into street photography, because when you're looking through the camera, you can see stuff that's going to happen in the frame before it does. You can see people literally walking into it, walking towards your frame. So if you see something interesting about to enter the frame, you're prepared for it, you're ready for that. So a lot of people really like that rangefinder experience, and Fujifilm has really enhanced it by allowing you to, first of all, the camera will show a frame that adjusts depending on which lens you have attached to it. So it shows you the actual coverage you're going to get. That frame will move to compensate for parallax, depending on how close you are to the subject to focus. You can also overlay an alignment grid. You can see exposure information. You can see an awful lot. You know, considering it is an optical rangefinder view, they've overlaid a lot of useful electronic information. But if you don't like that, if you prefer to have a 100% accurate electronic viewfinder, you just flick the switch on the front, some magical optical stuff goes on inside the body, and you switch to an electronic viewfinder like you get on a lot of other mirrorless cameras. But what makes this particularly unique is that the X-Pro2 inherits a trick that we saw previously on the X100T Compact, and that is a third mode, where you actually use the optical rangefinder view, but with a little window onto the electronic viewfinder in the corner. And they use this for focusing assistance. So the idea is that you frame it with the rangefinder, but wherever the AF area is on the frame, that bit is enlarged in the little electronic portion in the corner in this little window. So you get the benefit of both systems. You get the benefit of the rangefinder where you see this expanded view and it's very clean and everything's sharp, but you also get the benefit of being able to check your focus with all of those electronic assistants like focus peaking, magnification, all of that sort of thing, or even a split screen simulation to allow you to focus better. And this is really, really clever stuff. And it really defines and separates the X-Pro2 from pretty much everything else on the market. And like the X100T, it obviously adds to the cost of this camera. So if you're not interested in this capability, this hybrid viewfinder, then consider another model in the range, because you're paying quite a premium to have that built in.
Very good. Yeah, I think that's a good explanation of what's unique about this camera. The rangefinder is unique enough for people who aren't used to it, but this overlay mode is really, really nice. Now, they've done a couple of other things in terms of the LCD and the rear display on the camera. Talk about that for a second.
Yeah, so I'm going to, for the benefit of those who are watching the video as opposed to the podcast, I'm going to try and hold that up. And you can't see a thing. You can't see a thing with my lighting. Honestly, the menus did appear there. Fujifilm has fitted the X-Pro2 with a higher resolution rear screen and completely revamped its menu system. It is much smarter. It looks much nicer. It's much better organized, even nicer fonts. It's amazing how the user interface can make such a difference to a camera. And they've greatly improved it. But what they have not done is made it articulated in any way. This screen is completely fixed in place. It won't even tilt vertically, let alone flip out to the side. And it is also not touch sensitive. Now, regular viewers and listeners to All About the Gear will know that that is one of my major bugbears on modern cameras. I like to have touch screens and I like to have articulated screens. And I should say that when I was shooting with the X-Pro2, which I've been doing for a few weeks now, I really miss not being able to tilt that screen up. There's a lot of times that I would shoot at low angles or high angles, and especially in direct sunlight, it's really hard to do that if you can't tilt the screen. So I found that quite inconvenient, and I actually interviewed some of the Japanese managers from Fujifilm about this, and they said, look, this camera is really mostly about the viewfinder. Please compose with the viewfinder mostly. Yes, you can do it with the screen, but mostly use the viewfinder. That's what this camera is about. It's aimed at people who will mostly shoot with the viewfinder, not at people like me who like to compose at least 50% of the time with the screen at unusual angles. And in terms of the touch sensitive aspect, this is an interesting cultural difference. And I see this with quite a few Japanese camera companies where there is this perception that having a touch screen somehow makes it a less serious camera. I completely disagree with that. And it's interesting that Canon and Nikon disagree with that too, because with the D5 and the 1DX Mark II, they've gone for touch screens as well. So it's interesting that they've now seen it as a professional feature. So I wish Fujifilm and Sony would as well. But the reason I want it is to easily reposition the AF area. And Fujifilm has at least now equipped the X-Pro2 with a little joystick to the top right of the screen. I'm holding up to the camera if anyone's watching. And this really makes it's the second best thing. It's the next best thing to a touch screen for moving the AF area, because you can very quickly get your thumb on it and shift that AF area. And that's all it does. So there's no need to kind of go into an AF mode or press any buttons first. You just go straight to this joystick and shift it left, right, up and down or diagonally. It's very quick, not as quick as just tapping where you want it to go, but it's a great compromise. So this is a small but very important upgrade.
So let me ask you about that. So suppose you're looking through the viewfinder, either in rangefinder mode or one of the other modes, and you want to move that AF point. Can you see it when you're in rangefinder or hybrid mode? And if so, isn't it easier to move it with the joystick rather than taking it away from your eye, touching the screen, and then putting it back to your eye?
Well, I'm doing it now, Doug, so I can confirm that in the rangefinder and the electronic views, you can move the AF area with the joystick while you look through the camera, and it's very easy to do that. However, it would have been just as easy to tap the screen. I mean, Olympus and Panasonic allow you to do that while you're composing through the viewfinder. Some people don't like it. Some people manage to do it accidentally with their nose. But all of these cameras allow you to switch that feature off.
Okay, but can you, for example, I have a Leica Q I shoot with a lot, and I have a similar thing. I use the buttons on the back to move the focus point without having to take my eye away from the camera. And in my style of shooting, that's really handy because I'm usually shooting with spot focus, and I move that around depending on the composition of my frame. I love not being able to take the camera away from my face and touch the screen.
Well, again, this camera is designed for exactly that kind of operation, and right. as I just showed there, it's very easy to compose through the viewfinder and move that AF area. And again, it's so nice that you can actually see the AF area on the optical rangefinder view. It's really, really clever optical technology. And if you're ever in the car, even if you have no interest in Fujifilm cameras and you're in the camera shop and you see one of these or an X100T, look through it because it's really, really clever what they've done.
Yeah, I just want to point out, as much as I agree with you about the desirability of touch and tilt, Leica's coming out with a new camera that not only doesn't it have touch and tilt, this is a digital M series camera. It has no rear LCD whatsoever.
Yeah, I saw it. It was at Photokina, wasn't it? About a year ago. I remember seeing it and just thinking, well, if you're going to go down, is that the one which only has like 2 controls? Has a shutter speed
on the rear. On the rear, on the solid back, it should have been an ASA dial instead of an ISO dial. Yeah, it's pretty wild.
Yeah, I should also mention at this point that although the body looks the same as the X-Pro1, it is now fully weather sealed, and that is a massive benefit over the original model. Although I should point out that weather sealing is also available on the XT1, so it's not the first time weather sealing has been on an X body.
Right. And while we're talking about the body, how about SD cards?
Yes, well, after that, we must talk about more controls as well. In terms of SD cards, of course, that's what it takes. But it doesn't take 1 SD card. It can take 2. Yes, for the first time in a mainstream mirrorless camera, we now have dual memory card slots. So you can see them on the video if you're watching it. Hopefully, I'll turn it around so it can catch some of the light. Twin SD memory card slots. And like other cameras with twin slots, you can configure it to start on the second card when the first one runs out. You can configure it to back up everything, so you have identical copies of everything, or you can configure it to record JPEG to one and RAW to the other, which is great because you've got the possibility of insurance, you've got the possibility of being able to give a card directly to a client while you go away with another one, or the possibility to keep shooting when your memory card's full without having to think, oh no, I've got to change it over. So this is a feature that I think is very important for any camera that wants to aim at a higher end market. And it's the first time that we've seen it on any mirrorless camera in this kind of category. I believe it is on one of the Leicas, isn't it, Doug?
Not that I know of, no.
Really? I thought maybe one of the other ones had dual slots. But the point is this is the first time it's been on a kind of more mainstream brand or type camera. And I would really love to see this on the high-end Sonys and Panasonics and Olympus cameras as well.
Yeah, also the Fujis, we can talk a little bit about image quality at some point, but both you and I love the image quality, particularly of the JPEGs that this camera can produce and all the X-trans cameras can produce. So for someone who wants to shoot JPEGs, having dual cards is great because you can segregate your RAWs and JPEGs. As you said, that's just one of the many modes in which you can use this dual SD card feature.
While we're looking at the controls of the body, still there's so many physical things to mention on this. You'll notice that there is now a little dial on the back and a little dial on the front. This is something that's kind of been inherited from the XT1 and subsequent models like that. And it gives you extra exposure control if you prefer to operate the camera with these dials. But new to this body is they're now also pushable. You can push to click them like you can with some Panasonic bodies. So that's a really nice user interface enhancement. And if you go to the top of the camera, you will see that the exposure compensation dial, which goes from -3 to +3 EV, now has a C position, which effectively allows you to expand that to ±5 EV via the menus. You'll notice, eagle-eyed people will notice, that on the shutter speed dial, because of course on the Fuji X system, you do have a shutter speed dial and typically an aperture ring on the lenses to control exposure, so it's quite retro in that regard. You'll notice a position for 0.008 of a second. This has got a new focal plane shutter that will do a mechanical shutter up to 0.008 of a second, and it makes a really nice click, actually. It's a very satisfying camera when you press the button. There's something quite hard to describe about it, but it's very nice. And like the XT1, it has an electronic shutter up to 32,000 if you prefer to operate in complete silence if you're doing your stealthy street stuff. The ISO, in another retro move, is on a little kind of ring, and you pull it up and then you can turn it independently of the shutter speed, and then you drop it down when you get the ISO you want. So these are all little kind of nods to older cameras, older film cameras that are nice if you're an old fart knocker like myself.
We've talked about this maybe every time we've covered the Fuji cameras, but I love the design of these controls. I love the fact that there's a dedicated control for everything: aperture, shutter speed, and ISO, because it's very predictable. With my Sonys, for example, if I'm in aperture priority mode, the front wheel controls the aperture. If I'm in shutter priority mode, the front wheel controls the shutter. If I go to full manual mode, I can never remember which wheel controls the aperture and which one controls the shutter, because in those other modes, they shared the same knob. So I have to wiggle the knob and turn it and say, oh, wait a minute, I moved the shutter. It went the wrong direction. It went higher or lower. And I love the dedicated controls. It's like, gray hair, okay, but it's like an old film camera or a good Leica to me.
Now, the flip side to that, Doug, is that, again, if you look at the shutter speed dial, you'll see that it stops at 1 second and then B for bulb. So if you want to do exposures longer than 1 second, you have to put it on 1, or T for time, or B for bulb, and then actually use the dials to select those shutter speeds that are longer than that. Now, because I do a lot of long exposure photography, I find myself up against that quite a lot, and it seems a little bit counterintuitive to have to set the shutter speed dial to a position where I can then use another dial to get to access that extended exposure. And it's the same at the other end of the scale. If I want faster than 0.008 of a second in the electronic shutter, I have to put it to the top speed and then use a dial again. Whereas on a camera that only used those dials, those soft dials, so to speak, there'd be none of that switching in between. So there's pros and cons to both.
Yeah. On the other hand, if you're doing long exposure, by definition, you're not in a hurry.
Actually, you say that, but a lot of the time when you're doing long exposures, you're in blue hour, and I was doing long exposures with the X-Pro2 only 2 nights ago on Brighton Beach at the pier, and I've got a sample image, a 1 minute and a 2 minute exposure in my review at Camera Labs, and those conditions are changing fast. And I was having a chat with someone on the beach while I was doing this, and I was looking at the sky and thinking, crumbs, I'd better get on with this fast. So that's something you have to be aware of. Actually, while we're talking about long exposures, you'll notice the shutter release is threaded for an old style cable release, but I should also say it's got a USB port on the side that I used with my trigger trap cable via my phone, so that worked fine.
And does it also have Wi-Fi for controlling it that way?
Yes, it does. I'm glad you brought that up, Doug. As well as built-in Wi-Fi, the X-Pro2 also has 1080 video, not 4K video, but 1080 video at 24, 25, 30, 50, and 60p. But it does so with a new sensor, and video has never been a strong point of Fujifilm cameras, but I have to say that it isn't half bad, actually, on the X-Pro2. It's a lot better than it was before. I mean, it still lags behind some of the features of other cameras, but you can certainly use it and be very pleased with the output, which then, I guess, leads us into talking about the new sensor, which is the first new sensor Fujifilm has introduced for quite a few years. So we had X-trans 1 on the original X-Pro 1, then X-trans 2 that embedded some face detect AF. And even though it was just in the middle of the sensor, it actually did a half decent job of continuous autofocus. That's on models like the XT1, the XE2, the XT10, and so on. Well, those were all 16 megapixel cameras. Now the X-Pro 2 has a new X-trans 3 sensor. It bumps the resolution from 16 to 24 megapixels. Still has that unique color filter array. It's still APS-C in size. They've also taken the opportunity to broaden that autofocus array to about 40% of the image area. So it covers quite a lot, not just a little area in the middle. And it's a denser array as well, which makes it more confident at tracking continuously outside of the very center. And like I say, it does quite a good job of it. Should we discuss image quality?
Absolutely. What about the image quality, Gordon?
Well, I mean, the interesting thing is that I shoot with an XT1, which I'm holding up now. This is the XT1 body next to the X-Pro 1. And like most people who do shoot with the Fujifilm system, I never hear anybody complaining about the image quality. Nobody goes, oh, I wish it was higher resolution, but now it is with the X-Pro 2. So I was very keen to pitch these two cameras against each other to see what the differences are. And you can see some direct comparisons in my review at cameralabs.com. Basically, Fujifilm has managed to increase the resolution a little bit. It's not a significant difference between 16 and 24 megapixels, but there is a little bit more detail captured by the X-Pro 2. And I'm glad to say that there's no compromise in noise levels. So it's not better than the XT1, but it's not worse than the XT1. And that was the thing I really feared when they increased the resolution. So you kind of got the benefit of those extra face detect AF points and slightly high resolution without losing what made these cameras so nice. And that is just beautiful image quality straight out of them with no effort. And this is because of the processing. They've got these film simulations that simulate their old film, like Velvia, Provia. We saw the classic Chrome simulation added a short while ago, which is also on here. A new black and white simulation on the X-Pro 2 called Acros, which is not available on a firmware update to the older models because it actually requires the new image processor in this camera. So they're taking that forward. And again, like the XT1 and every other Fujifilm camera I've tested, the JPEGs are just gorgeous out of this camera. I can't improve on them if I shoot RAW. I'm very, very satisfied with the image quality from this camera. I've got loads and loads of sample images in my review from both Brighton Beach, which is slightly kind of dull light, and Miami Beach in America, which has got very intense light and very intense colors, and it just suits the camera so well.
Yeah. Now, talking about comparing this to other cameras, image quality wise, you did a fascinating comparison over at cameralabs.com. We'll link to it in our show notes for this. And that was to look at this camera compared to the Sony a6000 and the new a6300. The 6300 and this camera are both 24 megapixel cameras. And which seems to be sort of the new normal for APS-C or cropped smaller sensor cameras like this. So we say smaller. They're smaller than what we call full frame, but they're larger than what we call micro four thirds. So it's the happy in between, if you will. Tell us what you learned about that, comparing this to the other camera.
Well, the interesting thing is that Fujifilm has always had very punchy images straight out of camera, even with the standard Provia preset. A lot of that is to do with sharp optics, nice image processing, and a sensor that doesn't have a low-pass AA filter, so that the images are very crisp. But when I compared them directly against the A6300, I noticed that, in fact, the X-Pro 2 is applying quite a lot of sharpening as standard by default. Now, you can turn that down if you don't like it, and equally, you can turn it up on the Sonys. What my comparison also shows is the importance of a high-quality lens. because I had the Fujifilm with me when I was testing the two Sonys, I thought, why not include it? Because they're all 24 megapixel APS-C. And even though they're not rival cameras, I'm sure, I hope, that this 24 megapixel Fuji sensor will make it into future X series bodies that will rival the A6300. So I thought it's relevant for that. Unfortunately, all I had was a higher quality Fuji zoom compared to the Sony zoom that I was testing. So in some respects, it's a slightly unfair comparison because the Fuji lens I used was more expensive. It's sharper in the corners. But as you go towards the middle of the frame, both those lenses perform well, and you can really see the differences in image processing. And you can see how the Fujifilm by default was sharpening more so than the Sony. And again, it really boils down to personal preference. And as we discussed prior to the show, Doug, it's also, you also have to remember that when you're looking at these images at 100%, when I'm doing one-to-one crops, you're looking very, very closely at these images. You know, on a 24 megapixel APS-C camera, those pixels are tiny. So when you're looking at details that you might think, oh, that looks a bit soft or not quite exactly what I thought it would be, you got to remember that that is a tiny, tiny thing on the frame. So we're looking very, very closely at them. But I mean, overall, I'm very, very satisfied with the quality of the X-Pro2.
Yeah, it's important to remember that as we go to 24 megapixel sensors in this APS-C size, we're talking about a density of pixels that in full frame cameras would be the same as 54 megapixel images. So at that point, again, if you're looking at them at 100%, your lens quality is going to make a huge difference, as will one of our favorite topics, diffraction. Now, you ran your tests at f5.6. f5.6 is pretty much the max aperture that you would want to use without getting visible effects of diffraction. If you go even to f8, and certainly if you go to f11, at that resolution, you're going to see the effects of diffraction and your image is actually going to soften. So that's something to take into consideration. As you said, we're looking at, you know, lots of little teeny pixels and a great deal of detail. Both the cameras are great. Hey, let's talk real quickly about other competitors. As I said at the start of the show, because it's a rangefinder style camera, it's a little challenging to come up with competitive cameras. But what would you include in the list?
Well, it is difficult. I mean, you could compare it to other 24 megapixel APS-C mirrorless cameras, in which case it's up against things like the Sony A6300. You could compare it against Micro Four Thirds, in which case it's up against, I guess, the EM5 Mark II or the EM1 from Panasonic, the G7 or maybe the GH4 on price-wise. There's nothing exactly like it. Or in fact, on price-wise, you could compare it against even some of the full-frame Sonys. I think you could probably get an A7 Mark II, not an A7R or A7S, but an A7 Mark II for roughly the same price, which of course has a bigger sensor that's also got internal stabilization. And really, you've got to look at the different features of these cameras, as well as the output straight from them. I mean, the X-Pro2 is a very unique camera. The reason I'm excited about it is that even though it doesn't personally suit me, because the screen is fixed and not touch sensitive, and it doesn't have built-in stabilization either, the reason I'm excited about it is that it hints to what could be a future XT model. I shoot with the XT1. Hopefully, an XT2 would inherit the 24 megapixel sensor, the AF joystick, the dual memory card slots, the 8,000th of a second focal plane shutter, things like that. But it's difficult to find a direct competitor to this camera. I mean, it's because of this rangefinder viewfinder that just makes it completely unique and makes it the darling of street photographers around the world. I mean, street photographers love this camera, and they will love the benefits of this over the X-Pro1.
Yeah. Now, if you're using the electronic viewfinder, let's make it real clear here. If you're using the electronic viewfinder, and that's the mode you like, would you still go to the XT1, XT2 if there is such a thing? I mean, is there still a difference?
Yeah, I mean, obviously there's a few other benefits to the X-Pro2 over the XT1. You know, the AF joystick, the dual memory card slots, the sensor and things like that. But if you are going to be using the X-Pro2 with only the electronic viewfinder, if you have no intention of using the optical rangefinder, I would wait and keep your fingers crossed for an XT2. The real unique selling point of this camera, and the thing that makes it different from everything else in the range and pretty much everything else out there, is this viewfinder. You've got to want to use that optical rangefinder mode on it. I mean, maybe I'm wrong. Maybe these other benefits won't make it into future X series products. I find that unlikely to believe. I have no advanced information, in case you're wondering. If I did, I wouldn't even be able to tell you. But there's a lot of stuff on this that could appear on other bodies, and I hope it does appear on other bodies. But I would only get the X-Pro2 if you were intending to shoot mostly with a viewfinder and spend a lot of the time shooting with the hybrid optical view. It is extremely technically impressive, but I think, like you, Doug, I certainly prefer using just the plain EVF mode, in which case I may as well, compositionally, be using the XT1, which, of course, has the benefit of the flip-out screen, which I use a lot on this camera, a great deal on this camera.
Yeah, very good. What about lenses? Now, which lens do you have on there right now?
Okay, well, this is one of the great things about the X system. It only launched 4 years ago, but they've got some amazing lenses for it. I've got the XF 35mm f2 here. So everything's multiplied by 1.5 times or reduced by 1.5 times. This is like a standard 50mm lens. It's their second 35 lens. They had an f1.4 that they launched the system with. This is smaller and optically slower, so you may think it's inferior, but it's 4 years optically newer. It employs new tricks. It's sharper. It's also weather sealed, and I prefer it. This is a great lens to go with to go with any X series body. I would highly recommend it. I do a lot of landscape photography. I'm a great fan of the 10-24, which is an optically stabilized lens. This is the bigger problem I have with the Fuji system is that none of the primes are stabilized. So because the body isn't stabilized either, then when you're using primes, you've got to keep an eye on those shutter speeds, especially when you drink as much coffee as I do. So I like that 10-24 because it's nice and wide and it's stabilized. But there's loads. I mean, great portrait lenses, some telephoto zooms now. There's a 90mm that's equivalent to 135. That's beautiful as well. Every single one of those lenses is good, and I've got quite a few reviews of them again at Camera Labs.
For someone new to the Fuji X series, would you recommend the kit lens or buy just the body and add them one at a time?
Well, I believe the X-Pro2, depending on region, is actually not sold in a kit. It's sold body alone, assuming that you either already have an X-Pro1 or an existing body, or you're going to choose something a bit more esoteric to go with it. I would couple it, first of all, if you have no lenses, with this one, the 35mm f2, a great general purpose lens. They do have some good general purpose zooms. So they have an 18-55 f2.8-4 that is a real step up from normal 18-55mm lenses. And they also have a bright but unstabilized, I think it's a 16-50 or thereabouts. I think it's quite bright. f2.8 is also very nice. Again, reviews of them all. But for me, I'm all about the primes. And even though it means I'm operating in an unstabilized environment, I really, really like shooting with this 35 f2.
I always knew you were unstable, so now I've got confirmation of that, Gordon. Just one last thing to run down a couple of the other similar cameras, similar in some ways. You've got things like the Nikon D500 coming out. That's 21 megapixels, $2,000. Remember, this is $1,700 US. The Canon 7D Mark II, $1,500. So we're already down to less expensive cameras. The 80D Canon, $1,200. Nikon D7200 at $1,100. The Sony A6300, which I will have here in a matter of days. We'll be talking about that soon. 24 megapixels, 1,000. Oh, there's one right there, it looks like.
Well, no, this is the XT1, which is an older model, but this is also about $1,000 now for the body. So that's also an option. If you're happy with 24 megapixels and you want the tilting screen and you're mostly composing with the electronic viewfinder, good option.
Right. Well, very good. So we got a lot of choices out there. Like you say, a very unique camera. Best of all, the Fuji X-trans sensor images are always gorgeous. One of the best cameras you can get if you really want to shoot JPEG, because you will be really happy with the film simulations and just the general JPEG quality out there. Gordon, thank you very much. It's been another great review. It's been a struggle to get through this one. We had to restart a number of times thanks to Google Hangouts, but we made it. And I will see you next time. Thank you very much.
I hope you all made it to the end as well. Thanks for listening and watching.
Thank you all. It's been a great time here with Gordon Lang, and we'll see you on another episode of All About the Gear. And by the way, make sure you go to cameralabs.com. You can see Gordon's comparisons to the Sony a6000 and a6300 in terms of sharpness. And you can also go there to click on any of the Buy It Now buttons for any of the gear we talk about here on All About the Gear. It helps pay the bills. Once again, thanks a lot. We'll see you next time on All About the Gear.